He didn't want anyone to know about it. To hell with it if he had to pay the damage out of his own pocket. Reputation was everything to Alan Howe. Money was nothing. He was known to be as hard as iron, reliable and never prone to mistakes. He may not have been the most popular person in his office, but they all respected him. Even his bosses called him the strongest cog in the machine. Always on time, hard-working and unfailingly correct. Alan Howe did not make mistakes, and he was most certainly not seen as being unreliable. Being late was not something to which he was prone. Hello? Hello? He wasn't sure if he had dialed or not. Then he hit the speakerphone. The sound of a braying ringtone filled the car. The girl on the other end had to be half his age, he thought, and as they went through the motions of car details, his contact, and his location, he lost his temper when the guard explained to him that it would take an hour for them to get to him. An hour? He spat. I've sat on this motorway for an hour. I'm late getting home. I'm afraid we have a very high call-out rate right now, sir, the girl said patiently. We will get somebody to you as soon as we can. I want to speak to your manager, Alan demanded. He's currently very busy, the girl replied, voice cooler. If you could wait, we will have somebody with you as soon as is possible. This is outrageous, making somebody wait an hour in this rain. The girl had hung up already, leaving him only with a flat disconnection tone. Swearing under his breath, Alan leaned back and prepared to settle in for the breakdown people. It was raining hard. The little raindrops drumming on the roof of his car began to fill up his world as he squirmed for a comfortable sitting position. An hour was a long time to Alan. He did not object to being on his own, but he did object to being forced to be somewhere he did not want to be. It was getting colder too. The heaters were connected to the engine, and with it inactive, the naturally chill air outside was starting to seep in. He pulled his jacket on, huddling his arms close to himself. Being alone with his thoughts, the rain-falling humdrum, he came to wondering why the Sixth Symphony had set him off. It was a link to something in his memory, a strange imagining of swirling lights and a distant howling that managed to put him on edge, fearful somehow. He couldn't hear anything right now except for the rain. It was torturous, a constant drumming drone of water on metal and glass. The cold was pervasive. Alan couldn't work out why the battery too was dead. The car was currently nothing more than a shell in which he was stuck. He closed his eyes in a futile attempt to nap and kill some time. No chance of that, he thought. His car had become a sonic prison. He couldn't even see outside. The windows had misted up so much that it was like the world around him had gone out of focus into a great grey fog. Alan relaxed his head on the window, staring into nothing. Lights zooshed past him in the distance like shooting stars. Good grief, it was so cold. His breath misted in front of him. Did it always get this cold, this quickly? There was a tap on the opposite window. Turning slowly, Alan scrutinised the shadowy figure just outside the glass. He tapped again as patiently as before. Had he dropped off? Was this the breakdown man? Well, he had a word or two to say for making him wait for... Alan paused. He checked his watch. It had only been 15 minutes since he had called the breakdown service, and either they had significantly stepped up their service, or this man was not an engineer. The third tap was more insistent. Grumbling, Alan shifted over to the passenger seat and squinted through the misty window. A hood belonging to a large raincoat, rucksack straps over the shoulders. A biker. Or maybe some sort of hitchhiker, maybe a murderer who preyed on unsuspecting motorists stranded by the road. What, on a main motorway where everybody could see him? Not likely. Remembering the car had automatic windows, he gingerly opened the car door a crack. Yes? A pale but not unpleasant face smiled at him through the cracked open door. Hi, you okay? Seems like your car's had a little bit of an accident. Is anyone hurt? It's just me, Alan said curtly, and no, nobody's hurt. That's good then. What's wrong with the car? Alan was impatient. He loathed having to explain these sorts of details repeatedly to people, least of all a total stranger who had no business asking him. You're not a mechanic, why should I tell you? The man raised his hands in surrender. I'm not trying anything, I was just curious. I have a knack for repairing car engines. I just thought I could get your motor started. Alan, the kind of man who considered altruism a concept for science fiction, narrowed his eyes at his Samaritan. You could do that, eh? What would it cost me? The man's smile was disarming. There was no malevolence in his face, none at all. Nothing. Just a lift to the next service station, if that's okay. Alan glanced at the man, and then through the fogged-up windscreen to the indented bonnet. He thought for a few moments and then popped open the hood of his car. The man disappeared from the gap in the door and went around to the front of the car. Alan watched as the figure seemed to study his engine and fiddle around. Suddenly, much to Alan's shock, the lights came on in the car. The dashboard lit up and the radio slammed back into life. It was as if the car had just had a bolt of lightning shoot through it. The man closed the hood and appeared once more by the cracked open door. Is it working? Yes it is, absolutely, thank you, Alan said gratefully. All he had to do was to get it to a garage and they could repair it. Nobody would be any the wiser. Perhaps you misjudged this pleasant young man. Is it still okay for you to give me a lift? I don't want to put you out. Alan felt a wash of generosity overcome him. This man had just saved him a considerable amount of face. Hop in, young man. The man smiled appreciatively and opened the rear door. You can ride in the front, it's no problem, Alan offered. The hiker shook his head, removing his rucksack and placing it on the left seat. Momentarily, Alan flinched as the soaking wet rucksack made contact with the leather seat cover. No, I'll be fine just back here. I prefer running in the back anyway. Alan shrugged, not really caring either way. Though if he did turn out to have a hygiene problem, having him back there might actually work out well for him. As the young hiker climbed in and pulled his hood down, Alan finally got his first proper look at him in the rearview mirror. In the dim light of the car's interior, he saw a scraggly black beard and wet wiry hair with the same charcoal black colour. He was drenched, but curiously enough did not remove the black and red raincoat. There was something oddly familiar about the lad, but Alan couldn't work out for the life of him what it was. He caught Alan inspecting him in the rear mirror and grinned at him. It wasn't a sinister expression, more of a, I know you're watching me, sort of knowing look. I don't think I caught your name, Alan said awkwardly to cover his embarrassment at being caught staring. Peter, the hiker said. I was hiking up to Brigsham, but I got caught in the rain. Alan was flushing red. What if Peter thought he was one of those older types who propositioned younger men for... well, you know. Still, Peter seemed more interested in inspecting his bag and trying to towel off his hair with an already wet towel he had pulled from the rucksack. Is it cold for you in here? Alan offered, making to adjust the temperature. I'm sure you must be frozen stiff. Actually, I quite like the cold. Well, maybe you do, Alan thought somewhat uncharitably. He surreptitiously turned up the heater and gingerly eased their car back onto the motorway. The journey was conducted, for a while anyway, in total silence. All Alan could hear was the sound of the windscreen wipers and the monotonous drum of the rain. His gratitude for Peter's services was fading, and now he just wanted the journey to be over and done with. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Peter was sitting there, staring straight ahead, smiling enigmatically. For the first time, Alan felt uncomfortable. His passenger had been wearing variations on this same expression for the past 15 minutes now, without so much as once trying to start a conversation with him. Normally the idea of small talk made Alan queasy, but he would have killed for it right now. Instead he had to sit there and drive with Peter's eyes boring into the back of his skull while the strange young man did absolutely nothing. The temperature inside the car was similarly irritating. He'd cranked up the heat, and although the heat vents were straining to make the car a pleasant temperature, the air had an icy bite to it that Alan did not like. He couldn't take much more of this. The next service station, right? Peter did not move. Alan repeated his question, irritably. I said the next service station, right? I'd rather just go all the way to Brigsham if it's all the same to you. A reply shorn of all emotion. It was like Peter had just slipped into a drug haze. Alan's eyes narrowed for a moment. A kid could be on drugs, but Alan rationalised that if he was, he wouldn't have seen Peter take them. Not that he knew anything about drugs, of course, but there were always drugs at the bottom of things. It stood to reason. His knowledge of drugs, however, was not what was bothering him. It was that nasty, pungent odour that now tinged the air. Was it in the heater? Had a bird got caught in the engine? To take his mind off things, he went to turn the radio on once more. The station seemed messed up. The LCD display distorted and glitchy. Typical, Alan thought, more expense. But again, he would rather spend any amount of money than lose a modicum of respect from his superiors. He could see their faces at hearing he had broken the radio. Barely restrained amusement, stupid old Alan not knowing how these new-fangled devices worked. He jabbed some of the buttons in irritation. The burst of static nearly sent him off the road again, but soon the static began to fade. As it died down, Alan could feel that familiar dread inside him. Somehow he knew exactly which piece of music would be playing. Beethoven's Sixth Symphony once again filled the car. He could almost see those awful swirling lights again. Smiling nervously, Alan went to change the station. Don't touch the button. Peter's request was polite, but hard as iron. Alan was incredulous. This Peter might have helped him, but how dare he tell him what music he may or may not listen to? Looking up at the mirror to berate the young man, Alan had a whole piece prepared about how it was still his car, and therefore his music choice was final. Not that he ever got to say it, as his mouth clamped shut as he looked in the mirror. Peter was not looking too well, not at all. He looked maybe 3 or 4 shades paler from when he had picked him up, skin a waxy white sheen. Barely 20 minutes ago, Alan had picked up a pleasant, relatively healthy young man. Now he was looking sickly and exhausted, and sat as if propped up on a stick. He coughed violently. Are you all right? Alan asked. I'm fine, Peter said quietly. I think it best if we stop off at a service station at Brigsham. Please. Alan felt himself get angry. Now look here, I'm very grateful for the help you gave me, and now I want you to do a favour in return. And Alan, I said, Peter insisted, now looking directly into the mirror. Brigsham, please. That last please brooked no further argument. It had been as cold as a stone from 6 feet in the ground. The atmosphere was growing increasingly tense in the vehicle. Just who had he let into the car? It was possible his original assessment had been correct. He was a murderer. Alan liked to consider himself a good judge of character, but Peter eluded him. The smile on face was disconcerting, sure, but as far as his actual character was concerned, Alan was drawing a blank. He wanted to stop the car and force him out into the rain, leave him on the side of the road and never look back. Yet he couldn't put his foot anywhere near the brake pedal. Ahead of him, the sign for Brigsham loomed up out of the grey fog of rain, illuminated by his headlights. Feeling relieved, Alan pulled off into the road, towards Brigsham. We're almost there, Alan said conversationally. The figure allowed a thin smile to touch his lips. Yes, we are. The voice was soft, almost wistful. Alan felt himself unable to speak. He just kept on driving and prayed for the end of his journey. Worse, that bloody piece of music was playing out the entire symphony. He glanced fretfully at the rearview mirror, disconcerted by Peter remaining stock-still in the background, eyes looking up from under his hood. Peter's raincoat looked filthy and unkempt. It had high-vis stripes on it, muddy and scratched. Peter found it strange he was only just noticing all these details now. His breath misted in the air in front of him. That smell was growing ever more present too. He went to open his window, just to go some way to getting the stink out of his car. Don't do that. Alan withdrew his hand, startled. What? Don't open the window, Peter said, for the first time a hint of anger creeping into his voice. Why not? Alan snapped with righteous indignation. He had enough of that creepy little bastard in the back telling him what to do. It's my car after all. Oh yes, because it's all about you, isn't it, Alan? Your car, your life, your reputation. That's all that matters. The acid-edged reply, in which every you and your had a brutal razor's edge, sent a burst of shock through Alan Howe at that moment. He hadn't felt under threat the entire journey. Uncomfortable, absolutely, but hardly fearful. Now he was absolutely afraid. It spread like a ravaging fear through him. What had he done to deserve this? What had he... Alan paused, his fear trickling insidiously into his blood. It had only just occurred to him. He had never at any point told Peter his name. There was a shifting of weight behind him as Peter, or whoever the stranger was, leaned forward in his seat. The movement was clumsy, and Alan felt the pinch of his hand on the shoulder rest of his seat. The smell was putrid now, a vile smell of rot that made Alan gag. His terrified eyes tried to catch a glimpse of him in the mirror, but all he could see now was a blurry image of Peter's hood, slick with mud and rain. Alan could hear him breathing his irregular, rasping breaths on the back of his neck. As Alan tried not to panic, something lightly touched his hand and he cried out in fright. Glancing down quickly, he saw it was only a leaf from a creeping ivy, smeared with mud. It settled on his knee and he quickly brushed it off with one hand. You know, the voice was cracked and wheezing as it came from just beside his ear. You drove this road once before. Do you remember? Alan shook his head, His throat was dry and he could feel Peter's presence. His breath smelled like mould. "No." Peter's voice sounded like the opening of tombs. "Why would you?" The voice came back, snide and bitter. "It doesn't matter how much it costs. You just want your precious reputation intact. You choose to forget things, don't you? I don't know what you... Turn left. Now," Peter ordered harshly. Whimpering slightly, Alan Howe turned the car off to the left-hand turn, then indeed came up ahead of him. The roads were getting narrower, the vegetation more dense. "That turning's a hard one to miss," Peter said mockingly. "But you almost did." Alan wanted to reply, but something awful was happening in his brain. As he drove down this leafy, dark road with his headlights providing the only illumination, his head was taking him back to these swirling lights and the sound of howling. The howling was a rich, keening shriek, rather like a police siren. He remembered a night like this years ago. He had been driving his car. He remembered feeling a sense of horror, but knowing that above everything, Alan Howe had to be protected. The road reached a natural end, at the entrance of a crossroads. The centre was marked by a wooden sign, arrows with words that were totally illegible in the rain. "Turn left now. Not far to go." Peter's voice was sounding worse, if such a thing was possible. Alan didn't know whether to look back at the dreadful figure or not. Something else touched his knee, settling there with more weight than the last interloper. Alan, who was shaking in sheer terror, looked down. A flap of rotten flesh now hung on his besooted knee. His lips could not form the words. "Who are you?" he wanted to ask. His neck was stiff from rigidly staring straight ahead, eyes not looking left or right. He could feel the hand just to the right of his head. Alan was too afraid to look for it, for fear of what he would see. The road was darker now, branches hanging low. This was not a road often travelled. The road was strewn with leaves and his headlights barely cut into the deep darkness. "Stop. Now." Without even thinking, he slammed his foot on the brakes. The car, which had been moving considerably more slowly at this stage, lurched to a halt. "Get out." Alan was unable to obey the voice in his head screaming to run, to flee from the decomposing thing in the back of his car. But numbly he opened the door and climbed out. The rain still fell hard, and within a few moments he was soaked to the skin. He heard the back door open. Something shuffled out into the shadows behind him. "Now turn left and walk." Alan was shaking and whimpering, but he walked on elastic legs under the trees. He was in a daze. This has to be an awful nightmare, he thought in a paroxysm of horror. An awful nightmare. Whatever it was, his brain was telling him there were several things he knew to be absolutely real. The squelching mud and leaves under his feet as he went into the darkness under the tree. The cold of the air, the punishing rain, and the figure behind him, trudging slowly in his exact footsteps. What did this walking entity that called itself Peter have in mind? The questions he endlessly asked himself were redundant, he realised, worthless. No, instead the real question to be asked was why he had done what he had done. Oh, he had tried so hard to forget, and even took medication to forget, but his mind tried to make him pay. He remembered taking the road to Brigsham on a cold, wet night just like this one. "You forgot," Peter hissed in his ear. "You forgot. You might have forgotten, Alan, but the dead never forget. Never." Alan cried hard as he remembered taking that turn and not seeing the hiker. He'd been wearing a high-vis jacket. He lit up like a newborn son, but Alan had not been paying attention. Instead, he'd been shouting at the phone in his car, Beethoven blaring jovially from the car speakers. The impact had been ferocious. He had hit the young man at about 60 miles an hour. His bones crunched on the impact with his windscreen and rolled off his hood. As Alan had stopped the car, he'd stared in a daze at the crumpled figure in his headlights. Everything was a blur as he got out of the car. Hitting the indicator so the lights flared and swirled around him. Alan had stared at the body. Reputation. Standing. Jail time. Words had filled his head. Call the police, he thought. No, they'd have him for manslaughter. Murder. His record stained forever, his spotless reputation forever soaked in blood and shame. Then the sound of sirens snapped him out of it. He chose. He chose. Dragging the body off the road had been difficult. He was heavier than he'd looked. He might have dragged him down this exact route. In fact, stop, Alan. Alan froze to the spot. He was surrounded by trees, but it was so dark he had no idea where he was. Turn around. Alan was crying, his 5'8" middle-aged frame shaking with fear and regret. I'm sorry. He moaned pathetically as the rain plastered his greying hair to his scalp and his tears ran down his cheeks onto the leaf mould beneath him. Turn! The voice roared, distorted as if the mouth of the speaker were overcoming an obstruction. This time, Alan did turn. In front of him stood Peter, the hitchhiker he'd carelessly run down and then chosen to bury to protect his own reputation. Peter's hood was shrugged back. His face was rotting, his nose and eyes split, decomposed, chewed away by time and whatever had lived in the mud where his body had been dumped. His teeth were a lipless sneer, the one good eye glaring at him with a triumphant malice. Alan finally screamed, but nobody heard him. Nobody would ever hear Alan Howe again as the figure closed on him. Alan Howe did not turn up for work the next day, and his employers considered this highly irregular. Alan was never late or so much as sick, they rightly pointed out. Curiously, he wasn't there the next day or the next. Inquiries found he had not been home in several days, and the police were finally called in to search for a missing man. It was a few roads off the Brigsham roundabout and they found something. A car, matching the kind Alan possessed, parked askew at the side of the road. Alan Howe's body was uncovered in a leafy ditch, face a frozen mask of panic and shock. He had died of a heart attack, they would discover once his body was rushed back to Brigsham Police Station for autopsy. That was one mystery solved. The other, slightly more perplexing mystery was the other body, found several feet in the mud directly beneath Alan Howe. It had rotted away, but the skeleton of a young man named Peter Ford was certainly there. His bones had been broken, as if he'd been struck hard by a fast-moving object. The coroner said in his closing notes, this was a grisly little mystery the town of Brigsham would never forget.